Obviously, there's an election coming up. A lot of people are very emotionally invested in it. It looks like it's going to be close. So, understandably, a lot of people are very nervous about it. I'm going to try to convince you that you shouldn't be so nervous. So, one thing to keep in mind is that you never know what the long term consequences of things will be. However abhorrent you find it that the candidate you don't want to win may win, and I share that, you really don't know what the long term consequences of that would be. A good example is the 2012 election. I was very much for Barack Obama. I was very invested in it. I guess I'm glad he won, but in retrospect, I realized that had Mitt Romney won, Donald Trump would be off playing golf and we wouldn't be thinking about him right now because Romney would have been the Republican incumbent in 2016 and Trump would have not had an opening. I'll leave it for you to decide whether that would be better than what we have or worse. Depends probably on whether you're a Trump supporter, for one thing. I'm just saying you never know. And in the current environment, I would say that it's particularly true that you really don't know what next step is going to be best in the long run. Here's what I mean by that. If the standard diagnosis of America is correct, we're tribalized, we're polarized, the government's not working, we're reaching crisis levels, there could be actually violent conflict between ideological groups, all of which I think is true, then it may turn out that things have to get worse before they get better. That may sound crazy, but it's often true in life. Alcoholics, sometimes their lives have to get even worse than they already are before they finally decide to reform. Or a marriage has to get even worse than it is before they finally have the hard conversation and say, we need to do something fundamental here. I don't really think the nation is yet to the point where they're saying we need to do something fundamental here. It may have to get worse before that happens. I'm not sitting here hoping things will get worse. I'm hoping they won't. I'm just saying we don't know that getting worse isn't a prerequisite for getting better. History is a very complicated thing. It's just full of surprises. There are signs that our system is just structurally in trouble. And historically, when you look back and look at like major structural innovations in politics or geopolitics, they often follow horrible things. Now, I hope things don't have to get too horrible, but it is a fact that if you look at major institutional reforms in the international system, for example, like the United Nations, the League of Nations, whatever you think of those, they were major changes, okay? They may not have wound up working as well as people hope, but they were big. And both of them followed these huge global traumas. So for all we know, things are going to have to get a little more intense before we work this out. So that's one reason to calm down. Here's another reason to calm down. Although I share the view of my fellow blue tribers that the person heading the red ticket is somebody you really don't want to be president, we should all remember that our perceptions of the other tribe and their leaders are being filtered by the tribal cocoon we're in, right? The filter bubble, whatever you want to call it. You know, if you're on social media, that is like a machine for distorting reality. It's a machine for presenting you things that actually aren't typical of the other tribe as if they were typical, because there are people who want to convince you that they are typical, that the other tribe is as bad as this. So you may well have a distorted perception of how bad the people on the other side of the divide are. In fact, you almost surely do. If you're thinking of them all as bad, you almost surely do. And so again, a little humility would be in order. In this case, it's not just intellectual humility, but moral humility in a way. You know, studies show that the average person thinks they're above average, okay, in various skill sets. The average person thinks they're a better driver than average. They think they're morally better than average. Obviously, some of these people are wrong, right? You just do the math. Can't be the case that the average person is better than average. And look, I speak from experience in the sense that I'm a blue tribe person. It was the case that 3 of my 4 siblings voted for Trump. Then one of them died, and it happened to be the one who didn't vote for Trump. So now all my siblings vote for Trump. And they're not horrible people. We have our disagreements, but they're not horrible people. And, you know, if you ask them, well, why do you vote for Trump? They don't start spouting racist stuff. By the way, they have different issues. And one of them may be focused on the immigration thing, but even they're not spouting racist stuff. They have arguments about why they think there's too much immigration. So we don't know what the long-term consequences of the outcome is going to be, even the outcome you don't welcome. The other tribe's not as bad as you think. And, you know, if you're worried about the whole system getting upended by the bad person winning, the person you consider bad winning, there is a certain amount of institutional inertia built in. There's only so much they can do. I know if you're worried about Trump winning, it is said that, well, last time around, he didn't know what he's doing. This time he does. That's true. That's true. But there's still a lot of institutional inertia. I am predicting that 4 years from now, we will not have chaos, civil war, or a fascist take over the country. So, for example, here's a kind of concern you hear about Trump being president. You hear it on the blue side that I think doesn't withstand scrutiny very well. The concern is that, okay, this time he may find a way to stay in office and refuse to leave the White House, violate the Constitution's limit of a president to 2 terms, or may do something just equally in violation of the fundamental norms and laws that keep the country on track. Well, one thing to remember is that the way these challenges happen is they go through the courts, right? I mean, people challenge them, they go through the courts. I don't think even Trump is going to have the capacity to just put an end to the judicial system. And ultimately, these things tend to wind up in the Supreme Court. And it may be true that now that Trump really sees the lay of the land and understands things better and is going into office with his troops in line, so to speak, he will be more inclined to appoint just flat out Trump loyalists to the Supreme Court. Well, maybe, but he didn't really do that the first time. And that's the key thing. The composition of the Supreme Court's not going to change radically in the next few years, you would guess, given the age of the justices. And whatever you think of people who were appointed precisely to overturn Roe versus Wade, for example, there's a difference between being chosen for that and being chosen because you were Trump's childhood friend or something. None of these people were. And all of them seem to be the kind of people who are plugged in enough to the conventional establishment that they don't want to go down in history as having destroyed the American Constitution. Okay? Now, I share Blue Tribe concerns that Trump will make a lot of appointments to the federal courts that this time will be more cynical than last time around, and that'll gum up the works and be a problem. But still, there is a Supreme Court, and I think for these purposes, it's in pretty good hands. And, as for the concern on the red tribe, that Kamala Harris will do whatever she is alleged to want to do, turn the U.S. into a socialist hellscape or a DEI hellscape or whatever, I would say a couple of things. First of all, one of the criticisms of her that I've heard is like, what does she really stand for? I think there's something to be said for that in the sense that she's like a lot of politicians. She wants to maintain popular support, and it will not escape her attention that fears that she would turn America into a socialist hellscape or DEI hellscape or something are what almost lost her this election if she wins. So I just don't think you have to worry about her going off the deep end. She's a politician above all, in a certain way, more than Trump is probably. So I think if you go down the track and look at the various concerns, the specific concerns about what the candidate you hate may do, some of them at least do not withstand scrutiny, fully intact. So you never know. History's complicated. Ramifications can unfold in all kinds of ways. And sometimes things have to get worse before they can get better. My own kind of pet version of that is foreign policy, because I care a lot about foreign policy. And I think American foreign policy is deeply misguided in ways I won't get into right now. And I really don't see very fundamental, productive change coming in the next 4 years in either event. But perhaps ironically, I kind of certainly don't expect it to come from the candidate I'm supporting, which is Harris. I mean, I think on balance, Harris is the safer choice, including in foreign policy, like probably less likely to blow up the world. But, she seems to be pretty much a creature of the foreign policy establishment, which I think has made the world a much worse place in ways I won't get into. But I do think there has to be a reckoning, a fundamental reconsideration of the whole think tank infrastructure, of the way we think about American policy. But I do think there's going to have to be a fundamental rethink of foreign policy. And I don't rule out the possibility that, although I don't want Trump to be president, it could wind up that his presidency leads to that more directly than a Harris presidency would. Now, I fear that would be because of a certain amount of chaos he generates, but that may be the only way this happens. I don't know. Again, you tend not to get fundamental rethinking in foreign policy or anywhere else unless things get pretty bad. And they seem to be getting pretty bad, but maybe they're not there yet. And also, some of Trump's instincts on foreign policy actually appeal to me. I mean, I don't like the way he frames them. For example, his skepticism about the idea that America can solve all the world's problems, I applaud, but it seems there's kind of a selfishness about it. It's like, wait, we're spending too much money. And to me, that's not the fundamental issue. But in any event, I share some of his basic instincts. It seems to me demonstrated the first time around that he's just a kind of an unstable presence on the international stage, but it's not impossible that the candidate I don't want to win is in the end going to be the path to the foreign policy reform that I would like to see. That's something I can't at all rule out. So whoever's elected president, I'm going to continue arguing for the foreign policy I want to see, which will be taking sharp issue with either president. But this thought, which, does help me stay a little calmer than I might otherwise be. Again, there are things to worry about, but I think the biggest thing to worry about is that we'll keep processing information the way we're processing it. And as a result, the tribalism will deepen, the polarization will deepen, and things will get worse at this structural level. And the kind of good thing about that, in a sense, is that although you can't predict the ramifications of what's about to happen in some ways, and that's in some ways reassuring because it should lead you to calm down about the election per se, with the structural problems, it's a little clearer what we have to do, to me at least. It's more at the psychological, if not spiritual level that we need to do things. We need to get people to be less reactive on social media, more mindful of the cognitive biases that are warping their perception of the other tribe, better able to put themselves in the shoes of people in the other tribe. That's what we call cognitive empathy, not to be confused with emotional empathy. In other words, like feeling their pain. I'm not talking about sympathizing with them so much as just perspective taking. And I think that's a skill we're going to have to develop. And that's predictable to me. It's not predictable what exactly at a sheerly political level, the consequences of a Harris victory versus a Trump victory will be. And that can be a source of reassurance. You can't be sure that the victory of your candidate is the best thing at the political level because of the way ramifications unfold forever and unpredictably. But I do think we can be fairly sure that if we want to address the underlying structural problem, we just need to work on the fundamentals. Seeing things from the point of view of other people, being a little less self-righteous, being aware that the human mind naturally convinces us all that we're better than we are, have more intellectual humility, more moral humility. I think these are like basic truths. And that kind of predictability about like what it's going to take to improve the situation at a fundamental level is, I think, also a source of reassurance, because it means that even though we shouldn't get too wrapped up in the immediate outcome of the election, that is not a counsel of nihilism. I'm not saying nothing matters or it's so confusing we have no idea what we should do. No, you should support the candidate you, after careful reflection, think is the right candidate, but more fundamentally, you should work on the things I'm talking about working on that we all need to work on and encourage other people to work on them. And also be aware that if you work on them, that will have a certain natural contagion in the sense that you will be a less antagonistic presence on social media or wherever else. And so right away, you're generating less toxic reactivity on the other side. So who wins is important, but it's not as important as you think. Meanwhile, there are more fundamentally important things that we can work on and all should work on regardless of who wins. I'm not just saying, focus on your own local space because you have no influence on the bigger picture. So you might as well cultivate sources of meaning and be nice to your kids. I'm saying the things you do in your local environment do have wider ramifications, especially in an age of social media and online life. And this is the really good news. If you just focus on being a better and more fulfilled person in an enlightened way, you are making the world a better place. You are making it less likely that America will ultimately fall apart, because the effects of that cannot help but escape your local neighborhood. They will. And they'll do that all the more if you, make a mission of it. Like, damn it, I'm going to be a nice person online. It's hard. Nobody's going to succeed 100% of the time. My Twitter history is a trail of frequent failure. But if you more often than not are mindful and considerate and exercise cognitive empathy, you will be exerting a net positive influence on the world.